So, what is English Impressionism? Well, we know what French Impressionism is. It's working outdoors, capturing the fleeting moment, placing an emphasis on the effects of light, characterised by small, light brushstrokes, an absence of fine detail, the use of pure unmixed colour and so on. But English Impressionism is much less well defined, and it's really defined by a group of artists who claim to have been influenced by French Impressionism. But let's start at the beginning. Now, Constable and Turner produced work in the early part of the 19th century that did influence French landscape artists, who in turn influenced the next generation of artists, some of whom were the Impressionists. At the time, Constable's realism and use of colour was revolutionary. Might seem surprising. The Haywain, seen here, today is so uncontroversial it's been described as chocolate box, but then it earned a great deal of criticism. Critics described it as disagreeable, disfigured, mannered, and complained with phrases like there was a huge quantity of chopped hay across the picture. The Times noted his habit of scattering white spots over the surface of the picture. A criticism incidentally later applied to Turner. And one magazine described Constable's execrable taste having no resemblance to any appearance in nature. There was particular resistance to his use of the lighter shades of green, and there's a legend that his patron, George Beaumont, criticised him for not making grass the required mellow brown of an old violin, and it's said Constable took a real violin, put it out on the grass to show his patron the difference. However, despite this criticism in England, he was very successful and influential in France. In 1821, this picture, the Haywain, which was then called Landscape Noon, was shown at the Royal Academy, failed to find a buyer, but it was seen by two Frenchmen, the artist Theodore Roussel and a writer, Charles Nodier, and according to the French painter Eugène Delacroix, Géricault returned to France quite stunned by Constable's paintings. The Haywain was purchased later, along with two other paintings, by an Anglo-French dealer, John Arrowsmith, for £250, and both paintings were exhibited at the Paris Salon that year, where they caused a sensation. And the Haywain was awarded a gold medal, which was presented by Charles X. Delacroix wrote in his journal, "What he says here about the green of his meadows can be applied to every tone." An interesting comment that I think goes to the heart of what artists saw he was doing. Delacroix repainted the background of one of his paintings. In other words, the French artist grasped immediately that Constable's novel idea was that artists should base their colours on what they see in nature rather than what the old masters had done. This is Norham Castle Sunrise. It's a typical example of late Turner. Now, by late Turner, I mean the way that he painted, the style he painted from about 1835, when he was 60, until his last exhibition in 1850. The cold, ghostly blue of the castle contrasts with the fireball of the glowing sun, soft browns of the river bank. As an umber cow appears ethereally to be floating between air and water. He had painted Norham Castle many times over, I think, 15 versions of Norham Castle over the years. The first he painted in 1797 when he was just 22. Now, some see this as an early example of modernist work, years ahead of its time. Others see it simply as an unfinished painting. And it is possible the work was never finished and never intended for exhibition. Really, we'll never know. My feeling is that some of his late paintings were unfinished, but this particular painting, I believe it was an example of what he called elevated pastoral and was a finished painting. So, were Constable and Turner Impressionist painters? No. Impressionism was a particular art movement in France in the 1860s, 70s. However, they certainly influenced French artists, and their approach encouraged artists to look at nature in fresh ways. So here's an example of an Impressionist painting, French Impressionist painting by Alfred Sisley. It's got a particular interest, fascination for me, as it's about 5 minutes walk from where I live, this particular weir, although the weir today is different. It's been rebuilt. Sisley was born in Paris, but born to wealthy British parents and retained British citizenship all his life. His work didn't sell very well, like most of the Impressionists in the early days, and he depended on a generous allowance from his father, but then in 1870 his father's business was destroyed by the Franco-Prussian War, and Sisley remained poor for the rest of his life. Now, occasionally a wealthy patron would pay for a trip abroad, and that's how he ended up arriving in southwest London in 1874, shortly after the first Impressionist exhibition. You've probably heard this many times before, but of course the first exhibition wasn't called the Impressionist exhibition. The term Impressionism was a derogatory term coined by a critic called Leroy, and the name stuck, and in fact the Impressionists started to use the term themselves. Coming back to Sisley, he painted nearly 20 paintings of the area, East Molesey and Hampton Court Bridge. And we recognise this painting immediately as an Impressionist painting because of the features that I mentioned before. But in England, there were many influences mixed together, and English Impressionism is therefore a loose term describing British art of the late 19th century that was influenced by French art of the period. I'll mention another couple of influences. One of them was the work of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, an American artist who travelled between Paris and London. For example, in 1855, when he was 21, he was trained in Paris in the studio of Charles Glare, and other students there included Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir and Alfred Sisley. And so Whistler got to know, was influenced by, knowledgeable of the work of these artists. And so when he settled in London in 1863, those influences were with him, and his pupils in London included Walter Sickert and Philip Wilson Steer. Both developed forms of Impressionism that are called English Impressionism, and I'll come back to them later. And that brings us to 1886, when the New English Art Club was founded. It was founded by a group of about 50 young British artists, many of whom had studied in Paris and at the Slade School of Art in London. It was set up originally by 15 founding members, and they wanted to create an exhibiting society along French lines and break away from the Royal Academy. In fact, the artists were influenced by a French artist, Jules Bastien-Lepage, who I'll tell you more about in a moment, and the French Barbizon school, the school of art whose artists were influenced by Constable and Turner. One of the founding members of the New English Art Club was Whistler, but he submitted a work, in fact the one we've just seen, Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, and it was rejected by the committee. And this led to a heated argument with Walter Sickert, and Whistler resigned from the New English Art Club. Nevertheless, the members of the New English Art Club are sort of a sort of definition of the leading artists of late 19th century British art. There was, worth going through some of them, Philip Wilson Steer, perhaps the leading English Impressionist, John Singer Sargent, who became the leading society portraitist, George Clausen, the leading landscape painter, Stanhope Forbes, founder of the Newlyn School in Cornwall, Frank Bramley, a leading realist painter, Henry Scott Tooke, painter of maritime scenes and sea scenes of naked young men, Laura Knight, the first woman to become an academician by members' vote, and the Glasgow School, including Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, the wife of Charles René Mackintosh, Bessie McNichol, John Lavery, James Guthrie, and then finally there's the Camden Town Group, founded later in 1911. They met in Walter Sickert's studio, and so it included Walter Sickert, Harold Gilman, Augustus John, Wyndham Lewis, and Lucien Pizarro. So I've mentioned a number of the key names of the leading avant-garde artists in London in the late 19th century. Now, unlike Whistler's painting, which was rejected, this nude by Theodore Roussel was exhibited at the first exhibition of the New English Art Club, and it caused a sensation. And it was the public argument about this painting that helped unite the group of artists that we today call the English Impressionists, or if we include the very influential Glasgow School, the British Impressionists. But as you can see, the style here is unlike the French Impressionists. Just think of the style of Renoir, and you can see how different Roussel's style is. It was controversial. The Spectator magazine wrote, "It is realism of the worst kind. The eye of the artist sees only the vulgar appearance of his model, making it blunt and crude." However, in terms of his career, Roussel became a well-known avant-garde artist, and later the artist William Orpen described this painting as the best nude of the period. Now, Roussel was a French artist and a close friend of Whistler, and they both shared many things. That they both were in love with all things Japanese. You can see here the kimono hung over the back of the chair. Incidentally, the model is Hetty Pettigrew, who posed for both of them, as well as other well-known artists like John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Hetty Pettigrew met Roussel a couple of years before he painted this, and they became lovers, and she had his daughter. But Roussel was married to Frances Bull, and when she died, he married the widow of the Scottish artist Arthur Melville rather than Hetty Pettigrew. Now, I've mentioned this name before, Jules Bastien-Lepage, a major influence on European art. He helped define a style of Impressionism in Britain and influenced many British artists, including George Clausen, as well as the Glasgow boys such as John Lavery. This perhaps is his most famous painting, Potato Gatherers, and it was awarded the Légion d'honneur. A friend wrote, "His success at the last Salon has put him in the first rank of painters. All Europe talks of him. Paris resounds with his name." And he became very influential in Britain because he was seen as a juste milieu, a middle way that combined Millet's realism with Monet's Impressionism, thus overcoming what was regarded at the time as a weakness of Impressionism, that it failed to transform impressions into something great and lasting. Of course, we now see Impressionism as something great and lasting, but that was the way it was regarded at the time. And young painters who were disenchanted with the excesses of both sides, the conservative painters of the Royal Academy and the out-and-out radical school, found Bastien-Lepage's work a middle way or juste milieu approach as a way for them to take their art forward. Another Lepage, the emergence of followers of Bastien-Lepage over Europe led one critic to say, in each room, on each wall, everywhere you turn, Bastien-Lepage, everywhere, constantly, incessantly. The whole world paints so much today like Mr. Bastien-Lepage that Mr. Bastien-Lepage seems to paint like the whole world. Having said that, he wasn't universally admired. One critic described him as a sly trickster who fakes naturalism in order to please. And another critic wrote, Bastien-Lepage has neither ideas nor style nor a personal point of view. His vision is ordinary and myopic. There's art here, but of the smallest kind. He was criticised for being too photographic. Another critic wrote, the truth of art is not that of photography, as so many apparently believe these days. I think the success of this painting ultimately hinged on the viewer's interpretation of the look of the woman. Was she, and do you see her as a realistic worker in the field taking a rest in the middle of haymaking? Or is she a model playing a part in the studio created by the artist? Was she a humble, and does she look to you like a humble, earthy, hard-working peasant? Or as one critic called her, a repugnant, slack-jawed beast that is simply a model posing, a fake? I'll leave it up to you to judge. Obviously, many people at the time revered Bastien-Lepage's work, and many artists followed him. One of the leading English Impressionists was Philip Wilson Steer, and from the beginning of the 1890s he was probably the leading follower of French Impressionism in England. This picture was strongly attacked by the critics, dismissed by one as either a deliberate daub or so much mere summer madness. I love some of these critical comments. What upset the critics was its lack of detail, and as you can see, Steer, although he was influenced by French Impressionism, it would be hard, I think, to relate this to any particular French Impressionist painting. He had a style of his own. But the critics didn't like this lack of detail, this sort of fuzziness, this uncertainty about the subject, what's going on here. It was influenced certainly by Whistler, because Steer was one of the pupils of Whistler. And the view is probably Walberswick in Suffolk, because Steer made many visits to Walberswick. This is another of his works, Girls Running Walberswick Pier, one of the most, authentic Impressionist works in Britain. It was uncompromisingly avant-garde, although one critic described it as evil. The painting, I think, captures the warmth of a late afternoon sunlight, but unlike Monet, there are darker elements in this painting. At first it appears carefree. There's two girls dancing down the pier in the sunshine. But there's also, partly because of the texture of the paint, and it's heavily textured. I mean, you can see it in this reproduction, but in the original even more so. It's the feeling of doom or maybe claustrophobia is accentuated by these three shadows in the foreground. The girls, if you look at their shadow, they're holding hands, but if you look at the painting of the girls, their hands have parted, perhaps signifying a friendship breaking up. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. The long shadows suggest the end of the day, the beginning of evening, night falling and death. It's a flat perspective, a heavily worked paint surface, which takes us away from the meaning. We see it both in terms of interpretation of the meaning of what's going on in the painting, but because of the strong texture of the paint, we are brought back and just see it as paint on a flat surface. And so the work plays between those two. It's a balance between something where we feel that there's some deep meaning in it to paint on a flat surface. So it's a precarious, I think, successful balance between abstract pattern and profound meaning. Incidentally, Stier later in 1927 began to lose the sight in one eye and painted exclusively in watercolour with a looser style from then on, verging on the abstract. He continued to teach at the Slade until 1930. A final work by him, by Stier, Seated Nude, the Black Hat. He did paint a number of young female nudes, and this is probably the most famous, Seated Nude, the Black Hat. He posed women in a believable setting. Here the models playfully trying on a hatch is found in the studio. He didn't exhibit this though. It was chosen for the Tate. It's now at the Tate, directly from his studio later in 1941 by the then director of the Tate, who went to his studio and bought this painting. The reason it wasn't exhibited is Stier said, "Friends told me it was spoiled by the hat. They thought it indecent that a nude should be wearing a hat, so it's never been shown." That's his reason he didn't exhibit it. Now, that's an interesting comment, I think. It's there's a distinction often drawn in art between the acceptable, balanced, confident nude and the unacceptable, huddled and defenceless naked body. And the words I just used are quotes from a book written by the art critic and historian Kenneth Clark, The Nude, A Study in Ideal Form, his 1956 book. However, this distinction he made between the nude and the naked body dissolves even in Clark's writing, and Clark acknowledges in the book that sexuality is part of the attraction of the nude, and no nude should fail to arouse us in some slight way. I think a view, a dated view today that would be more carefully nuanced in today's art world. But it does highlight that the artist must walk a tightrope that sways between coarse sexuality and bland photographic representation. A picture of a body deprived of clothes is potentially embarrassing or shameful. And one of the characteristics of modern art, I think, is the blurring of Clark's distinction between the naked and the nude. And in this case, Stier played safe and never exhibited the work because his friends felt that the hat made or could make the viewer feel uncomfortable because of the implied sexuality of the hat, I guess. A more recent comment by the well-known art historian Linda Need points out that the female nude is a construct that controls sexuality, which is sort of another way of looking at it. Artists use many conventions to achieve this control. They might, for example, reference classical mythology. They might paint a hairless body, so an idealized body, a posed and static body, a pure and innocent expression. And it's a measure of modern art and the representation of the nude that the artist breaks or loosens one of more of these hidden controls, and so unleashes or suggests the unleashing of a potentially uncontrollable and unacceptable sexual force that embarrasses the viewer or makes the viewer feel uncomfortable in a social context. And in this way, the artist draws attention to some aspect of our society and its norms or expectations. In other words, it reflects back on us and makes us think. Final comment of my own, incidentally, is that I find the hat amusing. The naked body here is harmless, the pose is demure, and the hat, for me, just adds a jaunty note of humour. Leads me to another great influencer who brought French artistic ideas to London, John Singer Sargent, and a good friend of Monet. He first met Monet in 1876, but they became much closer 10 years later, and it was this was painted probably in 1885 at Monet's home at Giverny. And Sargent admired the way Monet worked outdoors, and he painted him here working outdoors with his patient wife sitting in the background. Now, John Singer Sargent came to London, settled in England in 1885, the same year, and was initially viewed as avant-garde, but later became the greatest society portraitist of his day. In fact, later still, he got fed up with painting portraits and turned to landscape art. He painted what he wanted to paint. One more painting by Sargent. This was his first major success at the Royal Academy in 1887, Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, a very popular painting at Tate Britain. It received an enthusiastic response. It's a large painting. It was painted on site of two young girls, Dolly on the left, who's 11, Polly on the right, who was 7, lighting lanterns in his friend's house. They're his daughters, in the Cotswolds. In fact, Sargent moved to the Cotswolds to escape the scandal in Paris caused by his painting called Portrait of Madame X. However, this painting wasn't entirely enthusiastic, and it's interesting to look at some of the negative comments. Some reviewers regarded the painting as Frenchified, although in fact it was immediately purchased by the Tate. But what interests me is this term Frenchified. It shows, I think, that the opposition of many critics to the avant-garde in France was fueled by nationalism, and it was an attempt by the critics to prevent the what they regarded as the evils of French art from influencing English art. This is La Thangue, an English artist born in Croydon but trained in Paris and inspired by French artists. In particular, he was influenced by Gustave Courbet and Jules Bastien-Lepage. and encouraged by them to paint these realistic rural pictures. Also influenced by the Impressionists, so sort of a combination of those influences. He adopted what's called a square brush technique, literally using a square-ended brush. Here, to striking effect, he could cover the canvas quickly and capture fleeting light effects. This, in fact, was painted in Norfolk, and it's characteristic of his work to place figures against a high horizon like this and flatten the picture space. A very effective technique. Another artist, George Clausen, painted this at Cookham Dean in Berkshire, which is where he lived. The model was Mary Baldwin, the family's nanny who lived close by in the village. And Clausen was one of the rural naturalists, a young generation of artists who painted these realistic scenes of everyday country life. Again, Clausen, was greatly influenced by Jules Bastien-Lepage. Now, Clausen exhibited this painting at the Grosvenor Gallery, very influential gallery that had recently opened in London to show works that by and large wouldn't be exhibited at the Royal Academy. So it was showing the new young artist's work. And the Saturday Review singled out Clausen's work for its truthfulness. The art journal admired his skill, but criticised the way he followed the late Bastien-Lepage closely. Incidentally, Bastien-Lepage had died in 1884. We think the figure, the girl is 16-year-old, life-size figure. It's a large painting. She has this abstracted and joyless look, and it was acquired by the Tate. It's been arranged to suggest a narrative, so it's not just a scene of people working like the Haymakers by Bastien-Lepage. There's a sort of a psychological state and a mood created, which we can read into it whatever we wish. The girl, you might think, looks sad and wistful. Maybe she's been waiting, standing at the gate for a long time. Maybe she's waiting for her lover or a husband who's gone off to war. It's her parents in the background, her father digging, but her mother looking towards her in a concerned way. So you can build up this storyline by examining the picture, which is typical of a lot of English art and the sort of art that was liked by a lot of the critics. Let's go in the right direction. I'd like to end with an artist that I think is one of the most influential artists of the early 20th century, Walter Richard Sickert. This is Summer Night, Nuit d'été, and we've moved a long way from French Impressionism and, for example, the gentle nudes of Renoir. We're in the territory here of, Gustave Klimt or Egon Schiele. Sickert produced a series of female nudes on beds called the Camden Town Nudes. There's no attempt to idealise the figures. They're gross, lumpen shapes, and yet they're honest portrayals of relaxed, naked figures. The rooms he paints typically are working class rooms, an iron bedstead, a worn carpet, crumpled sheets. Sickert criticised artists who idealised the naked figure, and he found his chief source of pleasure was in a gleam of light and warmth and life. Yet many commentators see a dark side to these paintings, suggested by the poor surroundings, the rough, painterly style, the coarse poses. Yet they can be seen as sensitive renderings of a sexually active working class life. Now, Sickert said, "The more our art is serious, the more it will tend to avoid the drawing room and stick to the kitchen." I think a profound thought that could be said to be the foundation of British realism all the way through up to the present day. It's the antithesis of Sargent's pretentious high society portraits painted in the drawing room. So Sickert is saying that serious art is realistic, is down to earth, it's working class, it's painting the way things are for the majority of people. Now, the previous painting was painted in 1906 on September the 12th, 1907. A London prostitute called Emily Dimmock was brutally murdered in Camden Town, where Sickert had his studio, and he painted at least 3 paintings at this time showing a clothed man and a naked woman. However, in his paintings there's no overt violence. The woman, some people say maybe she's just been murdered, but she appears to be sleeping. But it does appear that Sickert wanted to represent the murder, as this is one of the titles he used. The Camden Town Murder, originally entitled "What Shall We Do for the Rent?" He has been accused of painting sordid scenes, but a more accurate description might be an honest depiction of the degrading effects of poverty. And we must also bear in mind that Sickert's titles were often intentionally misleading or frivolous. For example, this painting was later exhibited by Sickert as Father Comes Home, and was sold later again with the title The Germans in Belgium. So we shouldn't, as many critics have done, we shouldn't read too much into Sickert's titles. They were sort of throwaway lines. What Sickert is interested in is and I quote, "the beauty of strong sidelines, the balance of tones, and the walls watching us in the quiet dusk." In other words, the reading of these paintings is the dark, forlorn, cold, cheerless atmosphere of these paintings is not what motivated Sickert. He was motivated by the fall of light, the balance of tones, the pictorial effects of the painting, rather than any deep meaning in the paintings. But there is a painting I end with, called Ennui, or Boredom. Perhaps he's best known and most widely discussed painting, and this is a study he did for the painting, and I'm showing you this study. You can see that he squared up the paper to make it easy to transfer to the canvas, which was much larger, unusually large in fact for Sickert at this time. Note the area behind the man and beneath the mantelpiece, marked with cross-hatching, these dark areas. And I'm now going to overlay this sketch with the painting to show you how close the two are and how the dark areas have been interpreted into the painting. You can see he's made some changes. The dark area behind the chap in the chair is maybe a coat on the back of the chair, or maybe it's just a dark area, and similarly under the mantelpiece there's another dark area. In stylistic terms, I assume that Sickert wanted dark areas to balance up the forms and the tones of the painting. If we look at the meaning, though, we see possibly a strained relationship between the figures, their lack of communication, they're facing in different directions despite being close together, they're staring off into space, they appear to be trapped in their surroundings, the furnishings reinforcing the theme, in particular the bell jar which contains stuffed birds, suggesting this suffocating environment. They're like the stuffed birds inside a bell jar. They can't escape, and they're stuck with their fate. Sickert's work gives us there's no moral to it, there's no certainty to it. He leaves it up to us to interpret the image. But it's now 1913, and we've moved from English Impressionism really into British realism of the 1920s and 1930s, in which I've given another talk. So that brings me to the end of today's talk. And as you've seen, English Impressionism was a broad church, covered a wide range of artists and style. I suppose the unifying theme was that the artists involved claimed to have been influenced by French art, French Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And I've given the impression perhaps of quite a strong influence on the British public by French Impressionism, but that isn't the case. The full impact of French Impressionism didn't hit the public until 1910, when Roger Fry organised an exhibition attended by 25,000 people called Manet and the Post-Impressionists. Post-Impressionism was a term created by Roger Fry on the fly to bring together a way of organising the artists that he wanted to show. And for many artists, as well as the public, it was their first contact with French art, and it caused outrage amongst the critics and the public. It was described as bizarre, morbid and horrible, and an example of French artists' moral degeneracy. 10 years later, Fry summarised this uproar. He wrote, "The artists were roundly accused of sexual perversion and moral depravity." This, of course, was only the Englishman's way of saying he disliked the pictures. And as I've shown you, there was a group of British artists who had been producing exciting and experimental art, pushing out the boundaries for many years before this 1910 exhibition, but it was Fry's exhibition that launched modern art into the mainstream of British culture. Thank you for your time. Goodbye for now.